Hey, so what's up? Hi there. Hello. So today we'll be talking about the biggest boss in World of Warcraft. Well, at least one aspect of the biggest boss. As we all know, the biggest boss in all of WoW is the character creation screen. Man, I spend more time on the character creation screen probably than I spend in game. Well, not really, but you know what I mean. So today, we'll do a tier list rundown of all the racial abilities and all the races available in Classic. One by one. Unlike the current WoW, your choice of race mattered a whole lot more back in Vanilla. And as you'll see, some of these racials completely counter some aspects of the game, giving you massive advantage in either PvE or PvP. So, we'll be ranking these racials one by one, and also we will be taking into consideration the usefulness of the racial in general. So I'm taking into account its PvP value as well as its PvP value, so both of those worlds combined. So let's say the Orc stun immunity racial is insane. It's overpowered. It's broken. But only for PvP. In PvE, it kind of sucks dick. So we'll go by that. And we'll rank them taking everything into account. Now let's break it down alphabetically. Starting with the Alliance and going with the Dwarves. We have Stoneform, Gunspets, Frost Resistance, and Find Treasure. So, if you're picking Dwarf, you're gonna pick it for the Stormform racial, since it's the only one that is consistent and consistently useful. Stoneform is inactive with a 3-minute cooldown, and it says, while active, grants immunity to bleed, poison, and disease effects. In addition, your armor is increased by 10%, and it lasts 8 seconds. Which can be read as, while active, fuck that rogue and he's blind. Which basically makes it the best PvP racial in all of Vanilla. With a bit of discussion for the Orc one, but we'll get to that one later. Oh, you didn't know? Well, blind is a poison in Vanilla. A poison type debuff. So, you can get blinded, pop your Stoneform, and it counters blind. Now, how this works is it dispels all these debuff effects, plus making you immune to them. And as an extra cherry on top, it gives you an on-demand armor, which isn't too bad as a tank, aka Proud Warrior. Also, this revolutionizes your PvP gameplay as a rogue, since you can safely vanish from a lot of classes that you wouldn't be able to as any other race. This is one of those flexible racials, landing it straight into A tier. So, gun spec reads as following. Gun skill increased by 5. This is really just filler, as hunters mostly get better bows and crossbows compared to guns. And again, this racial is just so subpar, it might as well not be in there. It's only useful for hunters, and well, not even for hunters. So it's pretty sad, and it gets placed into F tier. Frost resistance. Frost resistance is increased by 10. This one is not that bad as far as filler racials go, since it does come into play in 2 situations. One is getting capped for frost res at the Saffron fight, or maybe some other, and it does give you a small edge versus anything frost in PvP, mostly mages, which will be abundant. Pretty okay for filler, so I'm placing it in C tier. And lastly, we have Find Treasure. Allows the dwarves to sense nearby treasure, making it appear on the minimap, which is arguably the worst racial in all of vanilla, and I'm going to argue that it is. This racial does not stack with any other type of tracking, plus chests are really rare, even though their loot is pretty good. Don't overthink this racial, it's just so garbage, it's in minus F tier. Next up, we're going for Gnomes and their lineup of mediocrity. They get Escape Artist, Expensive Mind, Arcane Resistance, and Engineering Specialist. Now, let's start with Expansive Mind. Intelligence increased by 5%. The only sensible racial for any caster on the Alliance that is not PvP oriented. This bad boy increases your mana and spell crit by increasing your intellect by a whole 5%, which scales better the more and the better gear you have. That being said, this is a really underwhelming racial from a design perspective. This is the only racial on the Alliance side for those try-hard PvE mages and locks that just want to push damage. Due to the mix of positive and negatives, I'm putting this one into C tier. Next up, we have Escape Artist. Escape the effects of any mobilization or movement speed reduction effect. 1 second cast, 1 minute cooldown. This one could be really deceptive on a first glance since it seems like it gets rid of the biggest pain warriors have in PvP, and that is roots. And it does not have more than a 1 minute cooldown. However, the cast time of 1 second and the downside of not being a dwarf or a human, plus the extra downside of being a gnome, is in my opinion just so crippling. It's rare you'll see a lot of gnomes. However, this is a pretty kick-ass racial overall, and it does shine in some situations in PvP. I mean in PvE. I'm placing this one in B tier. Arcane Resistance. Arcane Resistance increased by 10. Another filler resistant talent, this one being only applicable to a polymorph? Maybe? Yeah, no. It's just garbage. Arcane isn't really found much in vanilla, and you'll have a whole 10 resistance to it. It's just sad. This is straight up F tier racial. And lastly, the Gnomes have Engineering Specialist. Engineering skill increased by 15. Surprisingly, this talent, racial, might be one of the good ones the Gnome has. A whole 15 skill in engineering is pretty nice considering it's one of the costlier professions and considering it's practically a must-have profession if you want to do some real PvP. This one lands in D tier. Now moving on to the humans and their diplomacy, human spirit, mason sword spec, and perception. I'd say next to dwarf, this is the go-to race for any Seer player trying to push the mirrors or push threat. First off, let's go over the mason sword spec, since it's the same thing. Skills with maces and swords, and two-handed maces and two-hand swords is increased by 5. You might look at this and think, wow, what hot garbage this is. Who needs a measly 5 skill on your weapon? Well, have you heard of glancing blows? Have you? This is the best racial for a melee DPS. Hands down, no contest, thank you, try again. In theory, nothing can beat a human fury warrior, precisely because of this racial right here. However, this is almost completely worthless in PvP, but considering just how good this racial is, I'm gonna have to place it up there in B tier. Moving on, we have Perception, an active skill with a 3-minute CD that reads, dramatically increases stealth detection for 20 seconds. Another racial that you can read as Fuck Rogues. Pretty good for what it does, Well, not really. I mean, it's not that good for what it does. The detection doesn't work so well. And vanilla, well, not as much as we can gauge it. Also, it's pretty filler, pretty straightforward, and only useful versus rogues or maybe druids. This is going down there in D tier. Now moving on to diplomacy. Reputation gains increased by 10%. Very simple, and at first sight very underwhelming. However, this is the beast of a racial, especially when you consider how many reputation grinds there are in this game. Reputation is always welcome, and 10% more of it means a lot of things. You can get discounts quicker. Did you know that you get vendor discounts based on your reputation with the vendor fraction? Yep, that's the thing. You can get attunements quicker. You can get recipes and formulas and all of the rep log goodness quicker. And maybe the most important part is you get time. Yeah, real life time. Not having to grind rep will give you the time to talk to your family, walk your dog, or finally take that shower. Or if you're being realistic, you're gonna get time to play more WoW. But at least you won't have to grind rep as much. And for those reasons, for me, this racial is straight up there in S tier. And at the end, all that remains is the human spirit, which reads, increases spirit by 5%. Another racial that is fairly underwhelming at first glance, but this time I'm not going to tell you that it is in fact awesome. You might expect me to say, but guys, spirit is a pretty good stat for leveling, negating a lot of downtime, blah de blah de blah. But the reality is, this racial is just 5% spirit, and that's really negligible. Unless you're a priest at a higher level with a lot of spirit gear, this talent just falls short. And even a priest won't pick human because of this racial. They'll pick dwarf because they're sensible. So all in all, this is a dumpster tier talent, and it's going into the dumpster tier, F. Now lastly, we have the Gnelves. With their racials being Shadow Melt, Quickness, Wisp Spirit, Nature Resistance. A relatively poor set, but let's start with Shadow Melt. Activate to slip into the shadows, reducing the chance for enemies to detect your presence. Lasts until cancelled or upon moving. Night Elf rogues and druids with Shadow Melt are more difficult to detect while stealthed or prowling. It has a 3-minute cooldown. Few things to note. It is usable in combat and it does disjoint some projectiles, so it is some sort of a shitty vanish. There's a lot of uses for some classes and not that many uses for others. Aside from the obvious, you just walked into my part of town, this effect is very useful as a vanish on druid or a second vanish on rogue, and as an option to maybe set more traps as a hunter. Plus, if you're really pro, you can snipe those mortal coils and other traveling projectiles. All of that sounds really amazing. However, the amount of time you can actually click this button is so rare, I'm gonna put it into B tier. Next up, we have Quickness. Dodge increased by 1%. Simple and boring yet again. This is arguably one of the better racials for a tank, but I believe the threat generation beats mitigation. So if you're trying that hard, you might as well go human. As everything else, this is really not even noticeable. This is F tier. Next we have Nature Resistance, which, you guessed it, gives 10 nature resistance. Now this one is slightly more useful than the Gnomes Arcane Resist, but only just slightly, coming into effect fighting druids, maybe shamans, and most of the time just helps a bit get a nature cap for AQ. It's boring, weak, but it's there for you once every blue moon, so it's a comfy D tier. And in the end, we have Whisper. Transform into Wisp upon death, increasing your speed by 50%. Sounds really much cooler than it is. When you die, your ghost form is 50% faster, and that's pretty noticeable. However, the point of the game is not to die, so mitigating something that shouldn't really happen is not that awesome. But it's vanilla, and it's gonna happen a lot. This does get you to your corpse faster if you're racing against another scrub who you just ganked in PvP. But in most cases, you're just going somewhere after a wipe and you get there first. Hooray! But you're just gonna wait on the rest of your raid or team or whatever. Not really a big fan of this one, and it's not that useful. It's a D tier. So now it's Horde time. Let's see what kind of useless poop the Horde has, starting off with the Orks. Enlisting Blood Fury, Hardness, Command and Axe specialization. Let's start with the good old Blood Fury. Increases base melee attack power by 25% for 15 seconds and reduces healing effects on you by 50% for 25 seconds. 2-minute cooldown. Now this is a pretty good one. A pretty damn good one. If you happen to be a rogue or warrior. Or in some fringe case, if you happen to be an enhancement shaman. Don't do it. It's like a high DPS on-demand trinket with only a 2-minute cooldown and the small downside of mortal striking yourself for 25 seconds. This racial can cause a lot of havoc, but you have to make sure it doesn't bite you in the ass in some scenarios where you have to get healed fast. I really like this button, and for a reason. 25% AP is no laughing matter, but taking into consideration if you're any other class of orc, you can just mortal strike yourself and that's it. I have to place this one into A tier. Otherwise, everyone would just be an orc. Next one, we have Hardiness. Chance to resist stun effects increased by an additional 25%. The number one reason anyone is considering picking an orc. The go-to, the best racial for PvP on the Horde side. This little gem has a chance to totally negate an incoming stun, making that rogue a very sad boy. It's very interesting how many racials so far are fuck rogue racials. As if Blizzard knew. This is another winner racial that you just pick orc, it's so good. Straight A tier. Now Command increases the damage of your pets as a hunter or warlock by 5%. This is really not that noticeable, and once again, it's only useful in 2 classes. But I guess Hardness is such an amazing PvP tool that orcs have to have something garbage, and it's another boring passive racial, and it's sitting way down in F tier. Lastly, we have X-Pets. Increases axes by 5. Pretty much the same thing as the human racial. This one is amazing and it sits in B tier just because it only benefits warriors and not rogues, like the human one. It's really good. Now moving on. Let's see what the Tauren get. War Stomp, Endurance, Cultivation, Nature Resist. War Stomp is a pretty cool racial with only a 2-minute cooldown reading. Stuns up to 5 enemies within 8 yards for 2 seconds. It does have a cast time of 0.5 seconds, leaving you free to do your business for only a brief second or so. However, a 2-second AoE stun is pretty damn baller in PvP, but its use in PvE is pretty limited. There's a few plays you can make, like surviving a burst from a group of mobs, or something like that. Even so, I don't think it locks that many options or breaks the game in any particular way, so I'm placing it in B tier. Next up is Endurance. Straight up 5% HP increase. One of the better filler racial passives. This one scales really well on tanks and makes it arguably the best racial for a tank, since it gives a very valuable source of mitigation. If you really want to try hard as a tank, I'd suggest going Tauren for this racial alone. On all other classes and specs, this is pretty decent, since everyone can use some extra HP. But as far as passive goes, but I'm placing it. As far as race to racials, pretty good, but still, it's a passive, and it's in C tier. Cultivation gives the Tauren plus 15 on their herbalism skill, which is, in my opinion, not that relevant, apart from the first 100-150 skill points. And it only benefits you if you're a herbalist, and it doesn't reduce the cost of leveling up the profession like engineering speds does. Another sad passive that gets put into F tier. And lastly, the Taurens have nature resistance. Same as the Night Elves, and I'm really not into repeating myself, and it's the same grade, D tier. Moving on, we have the mighty trolls, with their berserking, regeneration, beast slaying, and bow/throwing specialization. Once again, we'll start with the active, on a 3-minute cooldown that says, increases your casting and attack speed by 10 to 25%. At full health, the speed increases 10%, with a greater effect up to 25% if you are badly hurt when you activate berserking. Lasts 10 seconds. A really good and worthwhile racial for PvE for almost any class that synergizes well with any additional CDs or trinkets that you might pop at the time. It will usually give you 10% haste, but 10% is still pretty good. This one makes the troll the tryharders race of choice for the horde as far as casters and hunters go, since everything else gives barely any bonus at all. This is relatively lackluster in PvP, especially when compared to more PvP oriented racials, but at least it does something. And PvE, it's an amazing racial. It really shines, and I'm giving this one the S tier. Next one is regeneration. Health regeneration rate increased by 10%. 10% of total health regeneration may continue during combat. A really weird, underwhelming, and poor racial that might be slightly noticeable if you happen to have some spirit while leveling. But in all other situations, it's practically worthless. Another flavor of a bad passive filler that gets the F tier. Now Beast Slaying says, damage dealt versus beasts increased by 5%. Whoa, 5% on beasts? Stack this with the Beast Slayer enchant and no beast can stand in your way. Except that isn't true. Late game, there are barely any beasts for you to fight apart from grinding. And even when grinding, I don't think the 5% will be that noticeable. Or it's still something, and something's better than nothing. This is D tier. Lastly, we have a pretty good one. However, it's for hunters only. Throwing/bow spets. Skills with throwing and bow weapons increased by 5. While the throwing part of this racial can be completely ignored, the bow part is pretty kick-ass if you happen to be a hunter, particularly giving you around 3% hit. That's a fucking lot. This is always up, since you're level 1. And it does play a part both in PvE and PvP. So the Troll Hunter has a pretty big edge on the Horde side. However, being only useful for hunters, this one lands in C tier. Lastly, we have the walking corpses called the Undead, with their lineup consisting of the Will of the Forsaken, Cannibalize, Underwater Breathing, and Shadow Resistance. The Undead have a pretty nice pick of utility ratios, starting with the infamous Will of the Forsaken. Provides immunity to Charm, Fear, Sleep, while active. May also be used while already afflicted by Charm, Fear, or Sleep. It lasts 5 seconds and has a 2-minute cooldown. A straight up broken racial that not only completely fucks warlocks and priests, but is also relevant in some PvE encounters. This bad boy was later nerfed several times, but as it stands, it provides a fear dispel and immunity for the next 5 seconds, so you can even pop it preemptively. This is a really nice effect for the coolest race in the game. Straight up at the top, S tier. The Undead get a second button, aka another activated ability called Cannibalize. While activated, regenerates 7% of total HP every 2 seconds for 10 seconds. Only works on humanoid or undead corpses within 5 yards. Any movement, action, or damage taken while cannibalizing will cancel the effect. So basically you start eating your victim, acting as a taunt directed to anyone who recently died by your hand. This is pretty situational and pretty useful cooldown that minimizes your downtime and saves quite a bit of bandages during the course of leveling. It can also be a clutch combat heal for various PvE and PvP situations, but it does get easily interrupted and it does overlap its usefulness with bandages. However, I still rate it a B tier racial. Underwater Breathing is the next, giving you 300% longer breath than normal. And you would be surprised just how much easier this makes your life, however niche it is. In the situations that you find yourself underwater, it's quite powerful. 300% basically means forever, and who knows, you might even get the edge in some underwater combat situations. I'm rating this one C tier because for what it does, it's amazing, however rare those situations might be. And lastly, we have Shadow Resistance. And as we learned with resistances, they're pretty boring, and you do get 10 points in Shadow Res. This one is really close to Nature Resistance, coming into play only against priests and more often warlocks, and even in some PvE encounters, but those are pretty rare, and there are no fights that require Shadow Res cap. I'm rating this as D tier, and it fits there perfectly. So that's about it. Thank you for checking this one out. All of these are my opinions. If you have any questions, if you disagree, if you agree, if you have any suggestions, please leave a comment, leave a like, and it would mean a lot if you shared this shit. Thank you. Peace out.